Wow, I can't believe I executed that to perfection.
This is how you send off a character. In the Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode titled The Four Movements, Gina leaves the precinct with a statue and some parting words before leaving the show entirely, and it's honestly one of the more well-done send-offs for a fan-favorite character. It wraps up her character nicely, and she leaves in a way that feels pretty Gina.
Psych! Terry, did you fall for it?
Unfortunately, this is how you ruin a send-off.
Duncan, this better be good news.
Oh, it is. Your video's huge. From Spokane to Spain, you're global, Jeans. Now let's talk strategy.
This is gonna take a while.
This happens just 11 episodes later in an episode titled The Return of the King. Usually writers wait a season or two before bringing a previously written off character back into the series, but this just didn't work. And it's not because it isn't funny, it is. It didn't work because the writers abandoned all of their established character tropes in favor of creating something purely ridiculous. It seemingly comes out of nowhere and is equal parts jolting and insulting. Not only is this episode a structural mess, it's also an example of how writing characters from a perspective of indifference and disconnect can work against you in the long run. Brooklyn Nine-Nine's final season concluded on September 16, 2021. The Andy Samberg single-camera spoof of an overproduced police procedurals featured a rotating cast of award-winning dramatic actors alongside some of the most predominant names in comedy. Some of the characters stuck around for the entirety of the show's 8-year run, and some did not. There comes a time in almost every long-running television show in which we, as an audience, are forced to say goodbye to a beloved character. The send-off moment happens frequently in the world of television for a variety of different reasons. Contracts expire, new opportunities present themselves, people become problematic or prove difficult to work with, things can change, and writers have to adapt to the best of their ability. The problem with farewell episodes of television is that they, more often than not, end up being relatively self-centered. This is especially true when the farewell episode centers around a more tertiary character in the show's central plot. Shows abandon their plot lines and character development and instead end up focusing on saying goodbye. It actually happens quite often in the very police procedurals that Brooklyn Nine-Nine lampoons. Emily Wickersham was written off of NCIS to go on a sort of generic secret mission. Louis Lombardi faces a really gut-wrenching demise in 24. Of course, these episodes can be heartfelt and nostalgic, but as far as storytelling goes, these episodes have a tendency to feel more like they're just treading water. In the case of Gina Linetti, she receives not one, but 2 farewell episodes in the same season. Neither of these episodes are in the conversation for greatest episode of all time, but after setting such a high bar for a character send-off with her first farewell, Gina's second farewell episode really sets a low bar as far as Brooklyn Nine-Nine episodes go. Gina Linetti was a character that served her purpose beautifully throughout 5 seasons of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. She provided a veneer of tongue-in-cheek sarcasm and cynicism during what would be some of the more tedious moments of the show.
What is that? Cement! You just drank cement!
She often reminded us that we were, in fact, watching a comedy at times. Her complete lack of respect for the police department that she worked for felt like a perfect fit for the show's propensity to dip its toes into the realm of absurdity, but it also never felt like it was going all in on being completely over the top. Chelsea Peretti didn't leave Brooklyn Nine-Nine on bad terms. She just felt like it was her time to go. From various interviews, we can glean that this was a mutual split. Chelsea Peretti was welcoming a child and was looking to balance her time between work and being a mom. There was no drama, no mudslinging, no thinly veiled illusions of problematic behavior. In fact, Peretti worked closely with the writers and producers to give Gina Linetti a proper send-off. When Gina returns for her second farewell in what is arguably the worst episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, she is almost a different character entirely. The writers sort of take this weird moment to take the character of Gina Linetti and make their own cartoon caricature out of her. All of Gina's defining characteristics are amplified to a fairly large degree, and gone are the days of Gina's tenure as the assistant to Captain Holt, as Gina is now this sort of ridiculously flashy and successful social media influencer. This is a fun moment for the character and sort of serves as a bit of a status shift for the rest of the cast. They aren't dealing with the sort of dry, wisecracking, deadpan Gina anymore. They're dealing with something much larger. The problem with exaggerating a smaller character's features to this degree means that sometimes the more negative aspects of a character begin to sort of shine through. Something that once worked well because its subtlety might not work as well when amplified to a ridiculous degree. Gina's trademark cynicism and sarcasm end up being really difficult difficult emotions to amplify without creating a character that is about as unlikable as they come.
Duncan, I almost died. It was amazing.
Those tiny, brief accents of disaffected wit become long and exhaustive dives into unhinged narcissism. Imagine, just for a second, that these characters have little dials on every single one of their character aspects. Writers then spend the time fidgeting and playing with these dials to varying degrees of success. Generally, positive character tropes tend to be a little easier to play with. There are a couple reasons for this. The first being that it's more fun for the audience to watch characters who get along to some degree. Even if characters bicker, fight, scream, or just do terrible things, we need to be able to understand why the characters actually like each other, or at the very least tolerate each other for comedic scenes to really start working. The second reason is that positivity is much more malleable than negativity. In the case of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, it's more fun when we are watching our characters work together towards a common goal. It's fun to watch Terry and Peralta working on a case together. It's fun to watch Captain Holt deliver life lessons to the supporting cast. It's fun to watch our characters get along. If we take a moment to look at what is arguably the best episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine, The Box, we see all of our characters starting off in a somewhat positive place. Throughout the episode, the positivity and confidence the characters have slowly breaks down into uncertainty and desperation, and it feels like a very natural progression of emotional intensity. Now, if everyone started this episode in that negative place of fear and desperation, there would never be any emotional arc for the character. Everything would feel pretty linear and boring. It also wouldn't be nearly as rewarding to see the characters regain their confidence later on in the episode.
Oh, damn. Oh, damn. Oh, damn!
And that is 3 oh dams.
It is much more difficult to turn anger, fear, and sadness into happiness, in a way that feels natural at least. The one thing that sort of breaks these rules and doesn't really lean one way or the other is apathy. Creating characters that operate through an apathetic lens is the purgatory of character development. There's not really much to do with a character that doesn't care about themselves or other characters. This is a big part of where Return of the King starts to break down as far as a Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode goes. Gina Linetti returns almost as an insult to the rest of the cast. When she first departed the show, she sort of hung around a bit while the rest of the cast took time to almost persuade her out of leaving. She left a statue and a recorded message on the computer, and the characters seemed genuinely bummed that she wouldn't be around anymore. In Return of the King, she comes back without caring about anyone in the cast. She continuously blows off almost every character she comes across. It's like the writers were writing for a completely different person. She sends her assistant to planned hangouts at the pub. She ignores the requests, she disobeys direction designed to keep her safe from an assassination attempt. It almost plays out like the fun the writers were having in making Gina this new sort of social media diva came at the expense of trying to write a decent episode of television that made sense within the established context of Gina's pre-existing character dynamics. These episodes can feel ridiculous and fun, but when the plot lines go a little too far, things can really start to get away from us in terms of structure. There's a balance that needs to be achieved in an episode like this, and Return of the King scales, they never really level out. The pseudo-seriousness and parody that makes Brooklyn Nine-Nine so great is effectively thrown out the window in favor of creating some rather ridiculous and arguably out-of-character moments that don't really line up with the overall vibe of the show. For characters to work together, they must care about each other to some degree. If our characters can't find a way to connect with one another, the audience won't be able to connect with them either. Writers need to make the decision to care, and in the case of Return of the King, it's a good demonstration of how just because something can feel fun in a show doesn't necessarily mean that it will feel right to an audience.
Psst. It's me, Aaron. Dwight had me pretend to be a hipster to create hype, and it's working. There's already people camped out behind me.
This is wrong. And that was obviously an opinion. The Office is maybe the most successful television show of all time. I've got an entire miniseries on this channel dedicated to just that show. But I think what's most interesting about The Office years after its run is how opinion is molded into something nearly ubiquitous around a few of the show's episodes. Scott's Tots being considered by many the worst episode of the series. But I wasn't sure I agree with that. So I did some digging, looked around the internet, and stumbled upon something more than just a tad subjective. Almost objective, if you can even call it that, and what I discovered is that Scott's Tots is not considered the worst episode of the series in terms of ratings. In fact, it doesn't even crack the top 15 lowest rated episodes. So I decided to take a look at what is considered 3 of the show's worst episodes and break down what doesn't work when The Office fails.
The record, not all Italian Americans are in the mafia.
I think he just seemed like he was trying to sell me insurance.
This episode is a season 6 episode titled Mafia. During the show's run, this episode was considered one of the show's worst. For a while, it was my least favorite episode as well. But unlike the next two episodes, it doesn't land here. This is IMDb, something if you're here, I'm sure you're familiar with. It's a rating system that allows viewers to vote on the best and worst of, well, anything, assigning a rating to each episode of the show. Objective in that it creates a ranking based on those votes, subjective in that they're still votes, or ratings. So what is wrong with this? Mafia is a very funny episode of The Office, but it's one of the only episodes in the first 6 seasons that runs the risk of flanderizing the show's characters. If you're here enough, you know what that means, but for those who aren't, flanderization is the act of taking a single trait of a character and exaggerating it to the point where it becomes the character, swallowing the personality whole. Mafia encroaches on this territory big time. Kevin's never been the brightest guy on earth, we know this, but in Mafia, he behaves so incredibly stupidly that he ends up stranding Jim and Pam on their honeymoon after speaking to a banker and having their cards cut off. This is in between him using Michael's office just to flatulate. Pure ineptitude. Meanwhile, Michael mistakes an insurance salesman for a member of the Mafia? Well, that's funny. Well, it would have been funny. Instead, Dwight and Andy convince Michael that he is a member of the Mafia and string Michael along for an entire episode. Problem is, none of them seem to be aware this insurance salesman is just that. Absurd ineptitude. The point here is actually stated by Oscar.
Pam and Jim are on their honeymoon, so there's not the usual balance between sane and others.
By removing Jim and Pam from this episode, you have the chance to give your supporting characters time to shine. Instead, this episode shows every character at their dumbest, most manipulative, and most conspiratorial. The branch doesn't branch out, it flanderizes. This flanderization actually becomes the show's biggest downfall, both early and at the end of the show's run, forcing the show to rewrite Michael after season 1 and reintroduce Andy as essentially an entirely new character after his original guest run had ended. And to complete that, obviously this flanderization was the exact thing that took down the show in the last 2 seasons, specifically with Andy Bernard once again. But to this day, I find Mafia hilarious, even though it does foreshadow the show's eventual issues. So I kept looking.
Val's no help, Andy's gone, Jim's out. I just feel like I'm on my own here.
Remember how I said that Mafia didn't give its supporting characters the chance to shine in personality ways that you'd expect? Well, this is the 15th worst rated episode in the show's entire run. It's the season 9 episode, Vandalism. This is an episode that the industry calls a lower deck episode. A lower deck episode of a show is one that focuses primarily on supplementary or side characters almost exclusively, usually with storylines that don't move the overall narrative forward. At this point in the show's run, the very structure of the episode became one of the show's biggest issues. See, in this lower deck episode, every character behaves, well, in ways that feel a bit inauthentic. And it may not be surprising to note that the lead writer, well, this was only his 3rd credit of that kind, and it was the first episode directed by this man. Pam here is really the primary focus. Someone vandalizes the mural and she goes on the hunt. This ends with a very not Pamish confrontation at the end of the episode that is not as funny as much as it is strange. Daryl becomes a secondary focus. He's sick of dealing with Jim being a slob. But is that how you would describe Jim? I'm betting the answer is no, but it does create conflict. And Angela is throwing a birthday party with the senator, bickering with Oscar along the way and then being saved by Kevin. This episode isn't just usually unfunny, it often verges on surreal, like a series of deleted scenes or ideas spliced together to create a story. Almost like the budget had run dry and they had to work with what they had. The problem here is that when Michael left the office, the show made a grave error. Instead of trying to replace his presence, they began rotating new presences. It's not just that Michael was a great character, it's that he was the main character and his presence grounded the show's narrative and structure. When he left and that presence wasn't filled, the show became incredibly unfocused. As a result, every episode was forced to become a lower deck episode, a style usually relegated to filler episodes of larger seasons of serialized shows. So in turn, what Vandalism represents is the filler that should have been optional, not necessary. Not to mention, this episode carries the Looney Tunes approach that the show veered into here.
Here I am, signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours.
Get the girl. This season 8 episode is the lowest rated Office episode in the show's run. This episode represents almost everything wrong with The Office when it's not at its peak. This episode is what some call a road episode. It's an episode of a series that travels outside of its normal setting, a fancy TV phrase really meaning TV road trip. What really went wrong for The Office towards the end, and even in its failed spin-off episodes, like The Farm, is tonality. More concisely, inconsistency in tonality. As The Office lost focus, so too did its tone. While the show always flirted with the absurd, a lot of the last 2 seasons are pure slapstick. The Office meets Looney Tunes. In Get the Girl, we see a reoccurrence of things The Office had already done better, quite literally. A poor performance review, seen it. A newcomer taking someone's desk, seen it, and potentially job, seen that as well. And a love trip, also seen that. Except here, this B storyline does all of that worse and more absurdly than the show has in the past. Well, except for that road trip. Because more importantly, that B storyline clashes in tone dramatically with its A or main storyline, Andy going to secure his love with Erin. These are 2 different episodes of 2 different seasons of a show crammed together, and neither work. Andy Bedard's flanderization, full circle, reaches its peak here as his plotline sees him singing, heavy-handedly loving and reaching in some of the most awkward scenes in the show's history. A culmination, by the way, of a storyline, Erin and Andy, that didn't work well for nearly 2 full seasons, and yet here it's doubled down on. Again, in the most heavy-handed way possible. No subtlety, and believe me, little humor. This is all interspliced with the pure and utter lunacy of that B storyline. This episode plays like someone punching you in the face and feeding you cake in between each hit. If you're going to try to create emotional weight, you can't lift that weight every 3 minutes and hope it's still there when the audience comes back. Just like in life, emotion is fleeting, and if you get too distracted, well, the moment's gone, and so is the emotion.
Hey, guys, listen up. Michael is up on the roof and acting strange.
As all of you know, I love The Office, and I actually don't hate the final 2 seasons, but it is interesting that the 15 worst rated Office episodes only include 1 coming from another season other than those final 2. To me, The Office is a lesson in what it means to lose sight of your idea. That fleetingness again. When you do for an episode or a moment, like Mafia, it's okay as long as you regain that train of thought. Lower Deck episodes, road episodes, even bottle episodes make up the final seasons of a ton of sitcoms. Look at Family Guy, every other episode is a special now. South Park playing with serialization suddenly, and the list goes on and on. When you begin to use new ideas as a crutch, as opposed to a supplement, that's the moment your show has ended, whether you keep making episodes or not. Whether those new ideas are characters, love lines, or specials. So the next time you're writing something, or better yet, watching something, ask yourself this: can what's happening on the screen be described the same way as you would describe the show to your friends if you were recommending it to them? And if the answer is no, how long ago was it when that show or movie series was the thing you used to describe it as? If you can't answer that second question, it might be time to turn off the TV, because someone somewhere has lost sight of their Michael Scott.
This is gonna feel so good getting this thing off my chest.
And I further decree that everything will be just like it was before all this happened, and no one will ever mention it again.
This knowing statement, issued with a nudge, nudge, wink, wink, delivered in the closing minutes, was one of the earliest moments we knew The Simpsons would do what it wanted with no abandon. After years of intelligent, heartfelt comedy, the principal and the pauper flat out told us things were about to change, and not for the better. The Simpsons will always be a show that warrants discussion, from family dynamics, romantic relationships, and what exactly is small-town life. The creators wanted to both satirize and celebrate the day-to-day life of existence. We felt safe in Springfield.
We have roots here, Homer. We have friends and family and library cards. Bart's lawyer is here.
And while the newer seasons have lessened that trust and includes inarguably worse episodes, there were long stretches of perfection. Which makes Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper, hit us in the gut so much harder. The episode was written by pre-Futurama co-executive producer Ken Keeler and directed by Stephen Dean Moore. Aired on the tail end of what is widely considered the golden era of The Simpsons in 1997, it was a rare misstep that unfortunately became a harbinger of things to come. The episode feels slightly off right out the gate. Focusing on secondary character Principal Seymour Skinner, we follow him through his daily routine until his mother sneaks him into an anniversary ceremony in his own honor.
Put on your special suit and get in the car.
Yes, Mother.
So far, the setup is different than normal, but there are still a few wonderfully clever jokes to hold our hands. And there is something nice and kind in seeing Skinner relish in the mundane. They are telling us that Skinner doesn't want or need excitement and change. When we finally settle into the idea that we are following Principal Skinner, the episode drops its first bombshell. The man we know as Principal Skinner is actually a man named
Armin Tamzarian.
And yeah, it comes as out of nowhere as it sounds. A conveniently passing soldier in a taxi happens to notice the billboard celebrating Skinner and interrupts the ceremony to declare that he is, in fact, Skinner. Already, there's so many problems with this setup. From the unusual opening to the plot-necessary coincidence of right street, right time, it all feels so rushed. Whereas previous episodes took their time in explaining why or how this was happening, this episode has a goal that it barrels toward like a runaway train. While we've had episodes that do follow other characters, generally at least one family member was more firmly invested. When the Simpsons do show up for the flashback, they're just more vessels to dump exposition into.
Oh, it's one of those stories.
Speaking of the exposition, the abbreviated version is Armin was a troubled kid forced to enlist in the army who assumes his mentor's identity when they're presumed dead. Yet somehow, instead of moving the story along to deal with the repercussions of that fraud, the episode manages to meander about as though a criminal act hasn't taken place in front of their eyes for 20 years. In dealing with comedy shows, especially through the 90s, we as an audience grew accustomed to suspending our disbelief, to follow along as we enjoy the plot. But the plot here is so alien and completely out of left field, we're constantly second-guessing the show's logic, wondering why nobody in the small town realized this wasn't their hometown hero returned from war. In the flashback, the real Skinner himself constantly told heartfelt stories about their childhood in the idyllic Springfield. Armin found the stories so moving that he decided to straighten out his life and maybe someday settle down in a town like Springfield. When Skinner is presumed missing, Armin volunteers to deliver the news only to slip into the life of Skinner. But again, we don't see any of the decision-making. We are only told very briefly, and honestly, there's nothing interesting in how it's done. Perhaps if Armin had a scheme only to be charmed by the small community, or if Armin had done something more malicious to conceal his identity. But that never happens beyond a kind lie to make a lonely old woman happy. And Mrs. Skinner tells her own lie. It's clear she knows this isn't her son, but letting him in is easier than acknowledging the truth. But the Springfield we're shown just rebukes Skinner's stories at every turn. This was the first episode to make the town feel genuinely heartless, both to the plight of the recently freed from a sweatshop Skinner and the now aimless Armin.
Just put an X, then call yourself whatever the hell you want.
My name may have changed, but I'm still the same man I was last week.
Not to us, you're not.
There's just a general level of indifference on display that we haven't seen before in Springfield. The town has always been filled with eccentrics, characters that act as both oddities and extreme in their belief. But here, they seem apathetic to the plot happening around them. And that apathy seems to apply to Skinner and Armin also. Skinner quickly drops any anger directed towards Armin after realizing his mother had been taken care of during his imprisonment. While Armin is quick to abandon a life we know he loves, this episode single-handedly devastated our idea of Armin's beliefs. While the side characters have always been eccentric, they were also consistent in their eccentricities. Burns is money-hungry, Moe is a lovable loser, Sideshow Bob is a murderer, and the principal loved his job. But not in this episode. As soon as an obstacle approaches, Armin leaves Springfield for his hometown of Capital City.
Up yours, children.
When he gets to the city, there's an immediate sense of missed opportunities. Instead of still working to be a mentor, a skill he supposedly picked up from Skinner, Armin is wallowing in self-pity. Not only does this episode destroy the idea of Armin as Principal Skinner, it quickly walks back the idea that Armin turned his life around.
This is Armin's life, and maybe it's not perfect, but at least I'm back where I belong.
It's this haphazard approach to character that runs throughout the principal and the pauper that blatantly tells us none of this matters. Having a principal turn out to be as much of a troublemaker as one of the show's most beloved characters was almost a stroke of genius. There are countless stories to be told around this idea. The fact that Armin could be to Bart what Skinner was to him. With this new context of who the principal really is, we can understand Armin's frustration. No longer just uptight, he's seeing the boy he was, knowing the man he could be. It has to be heartbreaking knowing there is a chance for Bart that the kid just won't take. But none of this happens. The Principal and the Pauper was almost like the comic book What If or Elseworlds. Stories that warp and tweak an origin or write an abstract idea without the restraints of continuity. But in the years we had been watching The Simpsons, episodes like this did not exist. This wasn't a prediction like Lisa's future in Lisa's Wedding 3 seasons earlier. The Principal and the Pauper presented itself as true and steadfast, until the ending minutes when Skinner's mother and the Simpsons decide Armin must return to Springfield. The town rallies behind them. They excommunicate the real Skinner by tying him to a chair atop a train car, cheering as he's pulled away. When Armin asks what they do now, our judge decrees the entire town will act like none of this happened, and they do. The show carries on, Armin being Skinner once again, and we just don't speak about it. Now, there are definitely less funny, heartwarming, or technically well-written episodes than The Principal and the Pauper. Part of what makes this episode feel like such a betrayal is the fact that it sets a precedent the show will eventually follow for years. With this single episode, the showrunners and creative team told us, we'll just do whatever we want. Partly for shock, partly for experimentation, but mostly because we can. And they are not wrong. This show is in fact their show. They are the ones who have been trusted and hired to work upon the scripts and development, but that doesn't mean the stories ring any less hollow. There is no art without a level of indifference. As an audience, we don't always know what we want. It takes creators making brave choices to guide us along with them, but those choices need to be confident and assured. The Principal and the Pauper literally tells us in its closing minutes, none of this matters.
Well, from now on, you're gonna see a new Seymour Skinner.
Oh, no, we won't.
Yes, Mother.
Not for Skinner, not for Armin, not for the creatives working behind the scenes, and definitely not for the audience. That exclamation, shouted to us through the mouthpiece of a cartoon judge, may be what makes The Principal and the Pauper The Simpsons' worst episode.
Seriously, you don't understand. This is not for sale.
No, you don't understand, Canteen Boy. I want that canteen.
This is Adam Sandler, and as far as Saturday Night Live alumni go, he is one of the most successful cast members of all time. During his tenure at Saturday Night Live, Sandler created some truly memorable and impactful characters like Opera Man, the Gap Girls, and of course, the extremely questionable Canteen Boy.
You know, the city's redoing the sidewalks over on River Road. Yeah. Well, I leaned over the guardrails and I wrote in the wet cement, Cheryl Teague has big boobs.
Audiences really connected with Sandler's aggressive yet whimsical approach to sketch comedy, and some of the songs he created during his tenure went on to become chart-topping singles. However, Adam Sandler quickly found himself serving as the canary in the coal mine for one of the most turbulent periods in the show's history. Despite his star seemingly being on the rise, after his 5th season, Adam Sandler was fired from SNL. Saturday Night Live's hiring of Adam Sandler came largely at the request of Dennis Miller, who was at the time serving as Saturday Night Live's lead anchor for Weekend Update, and also head writer of the show. Sandler was having some small successes with roles on The Cosby Show as Theo Huxtable's friend Smitty, and starring in the low-budget feature film Going Overboard alongside Billy Zane and Billy Bob Thornton. Sandler was really focusing on his career as a stand-up comedian at the time, and after Dennis Miller caught one of his sets in Los Angeles, he made the recommendation to Lorne Michaels to bring Sandler on as a writer. In the world of Saturday Night Live, there are a couple different pathways for comedians to take toward becoming a player on the show. Some performers get hired as cast members right out of the gate. There are usually seasoned veterans from the nation's leading comedy theaters. However, some performers get brought in as writers first and eventually work their way into becoming a featured player. Sandler eventually made the cut and worked his way up to becoming a featured player, and was able to instantly connect with home viewing audiences. Adam Sandler's natural way of channeling testosterone-fueled aggression through a childlike silliness really seemed to click with people, and within a year, he became a full-fledged cast member. Sandler was definitely a unique presence on the show, to say the least. Comedy in the 90s was predominantly narrative-based. There wasn't really any precedent set for Adam Sandler's childlike absurdity, and this is how Adam Sandler was able to stand out from the show's primary cast of performers.
You did it! How do you feel? Like I can fly, senor!
However, this irreverent style of comedy can be polarizing, and a shift in ratings could be easy to pin on oddball cast members. In 1995, Saturday Night Live saw the largest ratings drop in the show's history. They estimated it was about a 19% decrease in viewership, and while a decrease in ratings is a very normal thing that happens on SNL, something this large demands immediate action from NBC's top brass. That action is typically a turnover of key staff members and performers. When Saturday Night Live brings on new performers, they typically begin trumpeting their arrival as loudly as possible across every conceivable media outlet and parading them around press conferences like horse shows. This is largely because marketing an all-new cast of performers is an easy way to stir up public interest in the show. Adam Sandler has gone on record to say that he believes that his firing was due to the people at the top of the NBC food chain just not liking the cast and wanting to take the show in a new direction. While NBC has never really spoken out on the issue, it's hard to look at what happened at Saturday Night Live in 1995 without things seeming like there was some sort of personal vendetta going on toward the cast and crew. Adam Sandler and Chris Farley weren't the only casualties of that season. Mike Myers left the show mid-season, presumably to focus on his film career after the success of Wayne's World 1 and 2. Janine Garofalo left the show after just 4 episodes of being on the cast, citing homophobia and sexism as her reasons for leaving. After Stewart Saves His Family flopped in the box office, Al Franken left the show and went into politics. And these are just the performers who left for definitive reasons. 1995 also saw the dismissal and/or resignation of the following performers: Kevin Nealon, Ellen Cleghorn, Michael McKean, Jay Moore, Chris Elliott, Morwenna Banks, and Tim Meadows. However, Meadows would have his termination reversed and remained a cast member for 7 more seasons. Never in the entirety of SNL's history has a turnover of this magnitude taken place. Some of the cast knew that their time was up at SNL, but some were completely surprised by it. Sandler didn't find out about his termination through traditional means, but rather through an awkward conversation with his manager. During a meeting, Adam Sandler was outlining his plans with his manager, which included what he thought he was going to do on the show. And his manager said something to the effect of, "What if you don't go back next year?" To which Sandler remarked that he still had a lot to do on the show and that he wasn't quite done yet. He also told his manager that he would think about it, to which his manager responded, "I think you've thought about it." When Saturday Night Live dismisses performers, it seldom explains itself. They break things off fast and clean, behind the security of what we can only assume is an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Saturday Night Live was Adam Sandler's only gig at the time, so he really didn't have an idea of what to do with himself. However, Saturday Night Live has a way of giving, even to the performers that it ends up terminating. While getting let go from Saturday Night Live undoubtedly stung, it opened the doors for Adam Sandler to become one of the most successful cast members to date. His breakout film Billy Madison was largely panned by critics, but it achieved enough cult status to warrant Sandler another leading role with Happy Gilmore, which ended up becoming a colossal success. After that, the ball kept rolling for Adam Sandler.
It's about time.
Hey, it is about time. I mean, I just couldn't get the ball in the hole.
The Wedding Singer and The Waterboy were both released in 1998, just 3 years after Sandler had left Saturday Night Live, and both became the #1 movie in America. To this day, Adam Sandler's films have grossed a little over $3 billion at the box office, making him the highest-earning Saturday Night Live alumni in movie history, if you don't count Robert Downey Jr.
I'm the best.
It's hard to believe, but that's more than Steve Martin, Bill Murray, Will Ferrell, or Kristen Wiig. Sandler has also held roles to a high degree of critical acclaim. His performance in Paul Thomas Anderson's Punch Drunk Love earned the actor a Golden Globe nomination, and his performance in Uncut Gems earned the actor an Independent Spirit Award. These are all things that Adam Sandler addressed when he returned to host Saturday Night Live for the first time in 25 years back on May 4th, 2019, when he played I Was Fired during his opening monologue. Adam Sandler's firing from Saturday Night Live may have come as a bit of a shock to him and his fans back in 1995, but as the saying goes, sometimes when a door closes, a window opens. Adam Sandler was able to turn his firing into a career of making the movies he loves to make and hiring his best friends to work on them with him. While the movies he produces all vary in quality, there is something to be said about what Adam Sandler has accomplished for himself. Isn't this the goal for us all? To be able to do the things we love to do with the people we care about.
Wants to see a double flip! Too high!
The journey to get to SNL is a long and arduous climb through this nation's varying proving grounds. Performers work and study tirelessly, trying to develop characters, bits, and routines that will land them one of the few coveted spots on SNL's cast. And for many of them, SNL is often the goal. Getting fired from Saturday Night Live could easily be interpreted as being the end of someone's career, but it often isn't. Saturday Night Live granted Adam Sandler enough recognition for someone to take a chance on him by greenlighting Billy Madison.
Now you're all in big trouble.
And he never stopped pushing. Adam Sandler's firing from Saturday Night Live is a testament to the chaotic nature of how Hollywood works. You could be down on your luck in 1995, but in 3 years later, you can go on to star in 2 of the most popular movies in America, cementing yourself as a household name.
I am the smartest man alive!
This navigation system's all messed up. It thinks we're in a park. Oh my God, it is a park! Away from the kids!
From 2009 to 2020, the television series Modern Family provided a satirical look at the ins and outs of the contemporary face of American suburbia. The show successfully upended the decades of sitcom conventions with representations of family that were largely limited to the post-World War II ideal of the nuclear family, providing representation that was sorely lacking in much of primetime television. Although the series certainly had its highs, it also had its low points as well. Despite upending many of the traditions of television, it still was unable to overcome some of the medium's most long-lasting conventions, leading to an episode that is the epitome of the problems with long-running television seasons.
Oh, jeez, look at that.
And now you stepped on it.
What? Well, what's wrong with me?
In Season 9, Episode 19 of Modern Family, we get an episode that encapsulates many of the problems with contemporary television. The cultural shift from network television to streaming services has forced the executives behind the scenes to rethink numerous aspects of just how television is made. While the prestige cable or streaming drama has found a strong place in our modern culture, network sitcoms like Modern Family are still seeking how to evolve in this new age. With so many streaming series out there, is it possible for sitcoms to maintain that traditional 22-episode season and still maintain our interest? Without the need to fill out a majority of a year's worth of programming, streaming television shows can keep their series concise and eliminate useless fluff and filler. As such, Modern Family had to meet those demanding 22-episode orders season after season. The show existed in this strange place where it was following the old ways of producing television while also being experienced and enjoyed through the more contemporary methods of streaming services. The show was available to stream on Hulu the day after it aired, and full seasons were streamable to new potential viewers at any time on other streaming services. The need for the 22-episode season was non-existent. The show did not need to be airing constantly to keep viewers' attention or to prevent people from falling behind. The ability to catch up on an entire series was always just a few button clicks away.
Your mind is scattered, Gloria.
Your mind is gonna be scattered. Manny, hand me the gun.
Beyond being tired and overdone, the plot lines we are given feel very out of place for the characters and involve nonsensical conclusions. Phil and Claire have a rematch of a race from all the way back in Season 1, which has some humorous jokes about how the characters have aged since the initial competition.
I immediately pulled that muscle that runs from the top of your head down to the bottom of your feet.
But it also features a running gag about Phil's robot fighting group, an obscure callback to a throwaway gag 8 seasons prior. It's a joke that not only is really for hardcore fans, but it frankly sounds like a more interesting idea for an episode. Similarly, this episode features Mitchell's sudden interest in law enforcement, a character trait that has never been mentioned or addressed in any capacity in the series up to this point.
I'm a cop.
I thought your alternate life was you teaching at-risk youth to street dance.
No, I teach them to believe in themselves through street dance.
That's what it is.
This plotline especially feels like an attempt by the writers to grasp at straws because of the way it ends with some half-baked social commentary on how the power granted to police officers can lead to the dehumanization of those who society deems criminals. Yes, as ridiculous as it may sound, that massive social issue is addressed by, generously, 3 to 4 lines of dialogue.
I don't think that I can just toss someone into prison.
It also goes against Mitchell's established career as a defense attorney, the person responsible for protecting people from overreach by law enforcement. Logically, this is something he should stand against, rather than be inspired by. Finally, Finally, the plotline that gives its episode the title follows Haley trying to convince Gloria to sell her salsa company to her new startup company. It's ironic that this is the titular plotline considering it's completely dramatically inert. Gloria at first is hesitant to sell the salsa. She agrees to take the meeting, but she seems to be trying to sabotage the sale. Jay believes it's because she does not want to let go of the family salsa recipe, and he rescinds the deal on her behalf. Gloria is furious because she actually did want to sell the sauce after all. As you can tell by this riveting summary, it's a very tedious plotline that leaves the characters in exactly the same place as the start of the episode. Nobody learns anything about themselves or the other members of the family. This only further underlines a major issue with the choice to put the plots of this episode together. Structurally, some sitcoms with large casts like Modern Family attempt to have their diverging plotlines coalesce into a satisfying conclusion, whether in a literal sense or thematically, but that never happens here. Instead, each of these separate plotlines reach their conclusions without us ever understanding the larger point of their relationship.
Maybe I was a little rash.
Really? Maybe a big rush.
Now, that's not to say that the current streaming model is flawless. One advantage of having a longer season and a week-by-week structure is that shows will simply stay in the public's mind for a longer period of time. When shows are released with an entire season at once, intended to be binged in rapid succession, the cultural discussion around these shows tend to burn out over the span of a weekend. People will discuss the latest season of Stranger Things with an excited fervor after it drops, but rarely does that excitement last beyond the first week or two of release. Our modern entertainment landscape is so overwhelmed and overstuffed with shows that are often treated as content fodder rather than works of art, and that can be especially damaging for streaming sitcoms. In fact, it's obvious that part of the reason for the success of streaming sitcoms like Ted Lasso is due in part to their week-to-week release. Or consider the series Mythic Quest, a show that released its entire first season at once in a bingeable model with very little fanfare from audiences. Once the show switched to a week-to-week model for its second season, it began to receive more attention from audiences. The major advantage shows like Ted Lasso and Mythic Quest have over network shows like Modern Family: shorter seasons. Even though they're returning to the older week-by-week release date schedules, those shows still implement shorter seasons, which often gives the shows more focused plot lines and a better allocation of budgets that creates a stronger visual sense than most network sitcoms.
We lost our baby in the car and people are judging us.
I swear to God, I'm gonna break it!
Do not break the window, you'll get glass on her.
Another advantage to the longer seasons of a show like Modern Family, it's the fact that the show had plenty of space to play around with and figure out the personalities of its characters. This makes it all the more frustrating when the show fails to deliver on previously established personality traits and canon portrayals of these characters, and instead falls back on two-dimensional portrayals that have never been a part of who these characters are in the previous 8 seasons. The choice to abridge the 22-episode season is not only necessary, it's essential for the medium. By providing a show's writing team to set the expectations of how many episodes a series needs to be, the quality of television shows will inevitably go up. In order for television to evolve and become its best self, these shows need to move beyond the dull, inspired filler episodes and the unwieldy season orders that make them necessary in the first place. Networks are desperate for content to pad out their streaming services, but it's not a glut of shows that will make their services popular. It's quality over quantity that is needed. Modern Family wasn't always perfect, but it had strong moments of comedic brilliance that were dulled as time went on by episodes like Chips and Salsa that feel like they were produced to fill a quota rather than inspired by the passion of the creatives behind the scenes. At the end of the day, the old adage proves true: less is more. Over the course of its 9-season run, How I Met Your Mother proved itself to be a case study in how a sitcom could quickly become a victim of its own success. While the show enjoyed critical and commercial success, its final season became infamous for a resolution that disappointed and confused longtime fans. But the writing was on the wall for this decline perhaps sooner than fans might have expected, and it all begins with the story of Slapsgiving.
It's the one day we set aside each year to gather together and give slaps.
question.
Perhaps the best way to explain the downfall of How I Met Your Mother is through the saga of Slapsgiving, a running gag where the execution over the course of the show is a microcosm of the show's inability to provide a satisfying conclusion to its audience. The story of Slapsgiving truly begins all the way back in Season 2, Episode 9, Slap Bet.
What the hell's a slap bet?
Whoever's right gets to slap the other person in the face as hard as they possibly can, but no rings.
In this episode, Barney loses the slap bet over whether or not Robin was once in an adult film. After Barney prematurely assumes victory and slaps Marshall, Marshall is awarded 5 slaps that can be doled out from that point on through eternity. This becomes a running plot point that continues all the way up to the show's final season. The slap bet represents one of the major storytelling differences between How I Met Your Mother and the average sitcom. Many sitcoms up to this point follow a cyclical format where characters experience conflicts that emerge and are resolved by the end of the episode. The shows were deliberately designed in such a way that audiences could tune into any episode and understand the entire plotline without any further context about the series. Of course, this structure was a necessity in the early days of television, where the only way to see an episode again was to be lucky enough to catch a rerun at some point in the future. As the modern age of television moved into season box sets and bingeable streaming, the sitcom was able to become more serialized. How I Met Your Mother in particular took advantage of this, building the ability to have callbacks to earlier episodes and plot lines an integral part of its structure. The show would even build out its characters' history with flashbacks and references to events we did not see within the timeline of the series.
Float on through, brother.
With its narrative framing device of each episode being narrated by the future version of the series protagonist, Ted Mosby, the show could easily slide in references to old storylines as necessary. This allowed for multi-season jokes and escalation of gags, such as the slap bet. While 2 of Marshall's slaps in the initial bet were used as throwaway gags, the writers decided to give the idea of the bet a greater focus in the Season 3 episode, Slapsgiving.
Well, there, you said it again. Said what? Slapsgiving.
In the episode, Marshall and Lily hold Thanksgiving at their apartment for the first time. Meanwhile, Marshall tortures Barney with a countdown promising that the night will end with the first ever Slapsgiving. The running gag of Barney's psychological torture over his fear of the slap is a great bit of comedic deflation for the character.
Oh God, don't slap me again. I don't want to get slapped again, and the first 2 times hurt so bad. I don't like it. I don't like it one bit.
Simultaneously, the episode also continues the progression of the post-breakup relationship of Robin and Ted, utilizing the show's serialization to great effect. Slapsgiving not only adds a great new comedic premise to the series, but also provides the series with a chance for genuine character development. This structure continues in the Season 5 episode, Slapsgiving 2, Revenge of the Slap. Once again, the writers find a way to both humorously torture Barney as well as advance the story of the characters forward. Here, the series introduces Lily's estranged father, and the episode ends with the 2 finding a sense of reconciliation. The idea of the slap provides the group with a tender sense of camaraderie as they each offer one another the chance to slap Barney with a heartfelt speech, ending with Marshall granting Barney a reprieve from the slap, but then slapping him anyway.
That's 4!
The writers again use the Slapsgiving episode to provide both the comedic tension of the promised slap and satisfying moments of character growth. In many ways, the use of the slap bet reflects the conceit of How I Met Your Mother itself. The slap bet has a clear end goal of 5 slaps, while also clearly establishing a structure to these stories whenever they arise. By comparison, the show's central premise of a father telling his children the story of, as the title says, how he met his future wife, provides a perfect framing device for a narrative as well as a clear endpoint for the series.
And that, kids, is How I Met Your Mother.
However, as the show continued on, the premise extended long past its logical conclusion, and thus both concepts began to collapse in on themselves. With the series, the story ended up lasting 9 seasons. One has to imagine the absurdity of a dad telling his kids a single story that lasts 10 years. By the same token, the slap bet itself was extended in Season 7, almost as if the writers knew they needed to pad out the possibility of not ending the bet too soon. Ultimately though, when it comes to both the story of how Ted met his future wife or how the slap bet played out, both come to unsatisfactory and frankly bizarre conclusions. Up to this point, the Slapsgiving themed episodes have a clear, satisfying structure. However, the final episode, despite using the Slapsgiving title, completely eschews the idea of Thanksgiving being a part of the episode structure entirely. Instead, the episode opts for a bizarre structure where Marshall claims he's been training to deliver the final slap to Barney. What follows is a series of kung fu film pastiche vignettes featuring Marshall's training to deliver Barney's slap. These sequences contain each of the central characters as martial arts movie archetypes, and attempting to upend the expectations of the audience, the writers of How I Met Your Mother instead left the viewer completely baffled. Perhaps the lesson to be learned here is that it's sometimes okay to fulfill the exact expectations of your viewers. When a series like How I Met Your Mother has gone on for a decade, the desire to break from formula and convention can be overpowering, and it can also be very successful. However, it's important to reflect on what tropes you're choosing to subvert and what is the artistic value in that subversion. Upending expectations just for the sake of surprising the audience will always be less satisfying than delivering a cathartic payoff to years worth of setup, even if that catharsis is exactly what the audience is expecting. There's a tendency in contemporary storytelling to always try and be 2 steps ahead of the audience, especially since modern audiences are able to theorize and predict possible plot points at a scale unlike anything in the history of fandom. However, an ending that delivers on exactly what the writer promised isn't a bad thing. In fact, it means the writer did their job correctly by establishing a cohesive structure that logically reaches its conclusion.
That's all of them. Wow. Wait. I'm free.
There's a reason why the cliche, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, exists in the first place. The writers of How I Met Your Mother fell victim to this trap. Instead of following in the tradition of prior Slapsgiving-centric episodes, they made a pretty hollow, bland, and tasteless parody episode that didn't advance any plot of characterization at an incredibly late point in the series' final season. The series had clearly established a pattern of emotional stakes and character growth in relation to the slap bet, but rather than delivering on that promise, the writers allowed those satisfying elements to fall by the wayside. The show's ending follows a similar suit, focusing more on upending expectations and delivering on an idea that seemed satisfying in the mind of the writers, but just left the viewers feeling frustrated. When creating mass entertainment, especially comedy, there's a delicate balance that must be struck between the artist and the audience. Now, sometimes an artist can deliver something that the audience didn't even realize they wanted, but there is also the risk of completely alienating the audience that brought you success in the first place. The saga of Slapsgiving illustrates how not to subvert expectations. Without providing the same level of craft and care, then surprising your audience won't matter. All they'll be left with is the unsatisfying feeling that their investment in the work has been wasted. A feeling that stings even worse than a slap in the face.
I can't believe you fell in too. That's awesome.
It's not awesome, Andy.
Well, at least my boss will listen to me now that I broke my clavicle.
It's not broken.
It is.
This is the pilot for Parks and Recreation, and believe it or not, it's actually the weakest episode in the entire run of the show. It might actually be one of the weakest television pilots in history. The characters feel like they are just slightly modified versions of characters from The Office, and it fails to deliver on anything you'd expect from a pilot. It really feels like the pilot was written on the assumption that a viewer's familiarity with The Office will do the majority of the heavy lifting in establishing narrative and still generate lasting, vested interest in the show, something at which it fails at almost completely. Producing an excellent sitcom pilot requires an incredible amount of finesse to deliver the intended result to a home viewing audience. A good pilot has to be interesting without over-explaining itself. It has to introduce us to fully fleshed out characters, while still leaving room for their growth throughout the series. It has to find a balance between delivering an engaging story, while at the same time, delivering on the intended jokes and humorous moments.
Leslie! Are you okay?
Too much story and the audience won't find it funny enough. Too many jokes and the audience won't be engaged in the story. It has to be relatable without coming off as mundane, and it has to be mundane enough to be relatable. A good pilot has to simultaneously thread multiple needles to be good enough to hook an audience and get them emotionally invested in the story. Once that audience is hooked and emotionally invested, they will go along for the ride until the sitcom inevitably begins to run out of gas. If a show is successful enough to make it to a 5th or even a 6th season, it really starts to operate on borrowed time. Contracts are starting to expire, showrunners change, writers writers change, cast members leave, all of those things and more become very visible on the horizon. Studios don't want to lose their viewers, and so they will often make attempts to pique people's interest in new shows by creating shows in a similar vein to what has already been so profitable for them. By 2009, The Office had cemented itself as a cultural staple. Seeking to recreate that magic, NBC reassembled the creators of The Office, namely Greg Daniels and Michael Schur, and tasked them with creating a new show in the same vein in hopes that lightning might strike in the same place twice. They were already creating a spin-off of The Office with Rashida Jones centering in the leading role. The decision was made to eventually pivot that show into a new direction. Thus, Parks and Recreation was born. The pilot episode is the worst episode of Parks and Recreation because it fails to innovate creatively within The Office's established and successful format. It almost feels like NBC offered a Mad Lib to the show's creators and said, "Give me The Office, but with blank." And they filled that blank in with government employees, and then they took the pilot for The Office, switched up a few character dynamics, and called it a day. Playing it safe is understandable. Networks are extremely averse to taking risks, so much so that they often conflate taking risks with innovation. This could very well be why the pilot of Parks and Rec is so lackluster, and the later seasons of Parks and Rec are so stellar.
Baba booey.
It's likely that before NBC would let Parks and Rec become its own thing, it would have to prove itself within the confines of some rather stringent guidelines. It's a little weird to think about. We want you to do the same exact thing, but differently. It seems slightly paradoxical. But this is often part of the deal when producing what is hopefully going to be a major studio's next cash cow sitcom. This pilot's approach to introducing its characters to us feels really clunky. A great sitcom pilot seeks to balance character introductions with an engaging story. We need the who, what, where, why, and how of the show to be communicated clearly and in a way that draws us in.
I still love that after 7 years.
Parks and Rec's pilot really focuses on the who and the where. We understand that these are people who live and work in Pawnee, Indiana, and that's about it. This episode spends a lot of time telling us what is interesting about these characters instead of showing us why we should be interested in them. Gaining the trust of an audience is a two-way street. For an audience to trust the writers need to trust that the audience will be able to understand what they are trying to convey. Any great television show allows the audience to figure things out for themselves. These superior programs essentially create a world in which we embark on a loosely guided exploration of the things the writers are trying to direct our attention to. We get to look around, and occasionally the writers shine a light on the things that are intended to be viewed with a layer of importance. In turn, we feel like we did the work alongside the writers and performers to reach our destinations throughout the episode. The Parks and Rec pilot doesn't afford the audience this freedom, and instead takes the approach of seemingly grabbing you by the face and telling you exactly what to look at and why. They are demanding our engagement without earning the right to have it. Once the writers get us in the door, so to speak, they need to deliver a product that lets us know it's worth our time to stick around for more. And this pilot just doesn't succeed in this area. Instead, it tries to reel us in without ever really setting the hook. None of these characters feel like real people. Instead, they come off as exaggerated caricatures of what certain types of characters are supposed to be. Take the introduction of Tom Haverford, for example. He goes straight to objectifying Ann Perkins without any subtlety or nuance.
I'm, very comfortable around women, attractive women. I've spent a lot of time with them.
His first line of dialogue is sitting at a table inappropriately commenting on her relationship with Andy.
Do you mind doing that somewhere else? I'm trying to watch TV.
I'm talking about the pit you fell in.
When we're introduced to the character of Leslie Knope, she's surveying 10-year-olds in a park and kicking a drunk man out of a slide. This isn't how people interact with one another, and is just another example of this pilot's inability to earn the laughter it is trying to achieve. There's a strange veneer of cynicism laced throughout the pilot as well. Many of the characters we are introduced to come off as being fairly abrasive and somewhat combative. There's an inherent snarkiness to some of the dialogue, and there's nothing that ever feels like it hits us in the heart and makes us feel anything for the characters. This could be due to improvisation, or maybe it's due to the fact that the actors are basing their characters off of a script that told them about as much as it ends up telling the audience, which is very little. If you look at the character of Leslie Knope in this episode, she's introduced as a somewhat delusional local politician who includes herself in the same group of women as Hillary Clinton, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Nancy Pelosi, all while hitting a drunk person with a broom. The joke lands, but this is a moment where we need to fall in love with characters, not go for jokes. Parks and Rec's pilot sacrifices substance for satire at almost every opportunity, and in doing so ends up feeling like it's just a loosely scripted joke showcase rather than a cohesive episode of television. And this would be fine if it were, say, a sketch comedy show where the premise and the joke are the centerpiece of what is making us laugh. This is a show that is supposed to be about people who we care about in relatable situations. This gets overlooked entirely. Obviously, this is not how Parks and Rec ended up. It was ultimately able to iron out some of the kinks made by the show's rocky start. Andy Dwyer's pivot from lazy, manipulative man-child into a lovable goofball was a good start. It brought a lot of charm, and Chris Pratt's chemistry with Aubrey Plaza is so relatable that it's tangible.
I never would have ever done this without you. Thank you.
The addition of characters like Ben and Chris really helped fill in some of the missing gaps, while at the same time helping the show really settle into its own unique style. The cynicism was dropped quickly and replaced with warmth and heart. Relationships started clicking, and writers really started to have fun developing some of the show's more colorful characters. Slowly but surely, Parks and Rec continued to grow and evolve to a point at which it delivered episodes that were on par with the best episodes of The Office, proving that slow and steady can win the race, and also that a weak pilot doesn't kill a series if the showrunners have the wherewithal to course correct at the appropriate time. Parks and Rec's pilot shows us what happens when writers who find success lose sight of what it was that made them so successful in the first place. We need to care before we can start laughing. We need to fall in love with these characters before we can start playing with the intrinsic hilariousness dwelling within them. In a way, we kinda need comedy to look us in the eye and tell us that it cares about us, before inviting it in for a nightcap.
Read it back to me.
Committees cover our democracy with blood.
Sounded better when I said it.
Look, it's not how I pictured it either, but I'm still glad we're doing it.
Me too.
Well, they're at least half right. Leonard and Penny's wedding certainly didn't turn out to be what anyone was picturing, but whether fans were ultimately glad the couple took the plunge was another story. Because amazingly, the matrimonial momentum found a way to turn one of the most anticipated moments in the show's history into the centerpiece of the worst episode of The Big Bang Theory.
We have the rest of our lives to dredge up stuff from the past and fight about it.
But before we get into our own big theory, why not take a moment to subscribe to the Nerdstalgic channel? Leonard, Sheldon, Howard, and Rajesh were all pretty stock nerd caricatures. And given their astronomical IQs, Penny was often left looking like a stereotypical dumb blonde.
A marathon? Wow, how many Superman movies are there?
You're kidding, right?
But in the pilot, they all came off with a surprising amount of charm. It ended up with Leonard falling head over heels for Penny, and their love story would become a central element of a show that would run an astounding 12 seasons for a total of 279 episodes. By the end of season 8, Leonard and Penny were engaged, and Sheldon had found love with Amy Farrah Fowler. In that season's finale, Sheldon calls his friends out for their failure to set a wedding date, so Leonard and Penny make the spontaneous decision to elope. It's a joyous moment for the characters and the audience. But on the way to get married in Vegas, Leonard confesses to kissing another woman in an isolated incident years earlier.
Would you rather I didn't tell you?
No, I don't want there to be secrets between us.
See, now I'm confused. I mean, what am I supposed to do?
Keep your mouth off other women?
Penny doesn't call off the wedding, but it's pretty obvious she's not taking it well. At the same time, after another of Sheldon's typical acts of bizarre insensitivity, Amy tells him she needs some space to reconsider their relationship. The audience then learns Sheldon was planning to propose to her, and the season ends on a double cliffhanger, with both couples in a precarious spot. The episode was particularly well done, and its cliffhanger is effective because there's so much love apparent in both relationships. The characters' affection for each other is evident throughout, and Leonard and Penny's decision to get married provides a nice emotional high for fans who are really invested in these couples. Audiences went into the summer break wondering how the conflicts would be resolved, and what they got was the matrimonial momentum.
Where are the rose petals?
We're out! We can use the potpourri from the bathroom!
Okay. Really, we're good.
Yep, just want to get married.
Yeah.
Leonard and Penny arrive in Vegas and await their nuptials at a typically chitsy Vegas wedding chapel that's next door to a strip club. The atmosphere couldn't possibly be less romantic, and they're both painfully aware of it. From the first beat, it's also clear that despite her reassurances to Leonard, Penny isn't particularly happy to be there, and even Leonard seems surprisingly unenthused about marrying the dream girl he's pursued for 9 years. The conversation in the car sapped everything of its magic, and it feels like they're just going through with it because It's what they had planned to do, thus the titular matrimonial momentum. When it comes time to say their vows, the ones Leonard writes are couched purely in terms of science.
I like to think those atoms traveled 14 billion years through time and space to create us so that we could be together and make each other whole.
It's consistent with his character, and Penny obliges him by acting wowed, but despite his years of love for her, they're totally impersonal and he kind of delivers them like someone reading a greeting card. Penny uses the lyrics to Randy Newman's You Got a Friend in Me from Toy Story.
Is that the song from Toy Story?
He loves that movie.
I do.
It's the only truly sweet moment in the whole wedding sequence, but we know she did it because she didn't have anything emotionally honest to say at the moment, so even that is kind of heart-wrenching. They return to their hotel where he carries her over the threshold and they try to act like everything is alright, but when they go to kiss, the truth finally becomes unavoidable. She's still angry about what he confessed. It causes a fight and the two head home to their separate apartments. There was nothing inherently wrong with the idea of Leonard and Penny's wedding being a disaster in one form or another. The writers were trying to create a situation where both Leonard and Penny, scared of getting married for different reasons, are trying to subconsciously sabotage the wedding. The problem is there's nothing funny about that. So almost the entire wedding sequence is just uncomfortable to watch, which is of course by design, but that discomfort is never alleviated. And the episode's B-plot doesn't help because it's arguably even less fun to watch. While Leonard and Penny are doing their thing, Sheldon shows up at Amy's after she told him to give her space, and is, as usual, unrelentingly self-centered.
Well, it's only been 11 hours. The Lord of the Rings trilogy was nearly 11 hours. I made you watch that. You said it was an eternity.
He then follows her to Howard and Bernadette's house, even though he knows he's not invited, and insists on being let in even though everyone has made it clear it would be awkward. Once they do relent and bring him inside, Sheldon quickly insults Amy by implying she's getting old.
Well, you should think fast, because men can sire offspring their entire lives, but those eggs you're toting around have a sell-by date.
Prompting her to dump him and run off. After everything has died down, Sheldon visits Penny for coffee, but gets angry at her and storms out because she didn't try to talk Amy out of dumping him. The episode finally ends when a defeated Leonard laments to Sheldon that he didn't picture his wedding night turning out like this.
Really? I never imagined any other way.
The whole thing is just kind of depressing. The episode ends on a downbeat, but that's not its problem. The problem is that the matrimonial momentum is pretty much nothing but downbeats. This is partially explained by the fact that it serves as something of an unofficial two-parter with a subsequent installment, the separation oscillation. At the end of that one, Leonard and Penny reconcile and decide to stay married, which is nice, but saving that resolution for the second episode of the season left the premiere in a tough spot. The matrimonial momentum had to ruin Leonard and Penny's wedding, without fixing things by the end. But in addition to being denied a happy ending, the episode was also denied the comic relief of a lighter B-plot. Instead, the B-plot is busy adding to the bad vibes by breaking up another fan-favorite couple, and doing it in a way that didn't make Sheldon look so hot. His behavior toward Amy comes off as sexist, especially in combination with his misogynistic rantings to Leonard. The show writes it off as Sheldon's general social dysfunction, but it's hard not to notice that his anger in this episode frequently takes the form of a generalized hatred of women.
And you know why? Because you're a man. The champagne of genders.
And like the main storyline, the B-plot also doesn't have a lot of laughs in it. And it's not for the lack of trying, but the writer's attempts to wring humor for moments like Howard comparing Amy to an abusive victim, or Stuart creepily showing sexual interest in both Amy and Penny at inappropriate times, fall flat, especially in the serious story context of an ugly breakup. The problem is also weirdly exacerbated by the show's laugh track, which seems to find everyone's heartbreak laugh-out-loud uproarious.
Listen, I may not have been entirely faithful, but you are not easy to lift.
The whole thing is especially disappointing because of how well the show's writers handled similar stories in the past. Take, for example, Season 3's The Wheaton Recurrence. That episode also features Leonard and Penny navigating a relationship problem, a scene where Sheldon comes to talk to Penny about those troubles, and an ending where the couple breaks up. Whereas the wedding episode is relentlessly downbeat, The Wheaton Recurrence chooses its moments when it comes to delivering the sad stuff, which makes those moments much more effective. The love between the characters is also unmistakable, which stands in stark contrast to the matrimonial momentum where everyone seems a little extra insensitive to each other. The earlier episode is also consistently funny, features a hilarious B-plot with guest star Will Wheaton, and ends on a lighthearted sight gag.
I gotta call you back. I want to bet, and it's time to collect.
The wedding of two beloved characters fans had been following for over 8 seasons wound up being joyless. For what it's worth, the show did try to make the botched wedding up to fans a year later when Leonard and Penny had a second wedding in the season 10 premiere, The Conjugal Conjecture. And that was probably always the plan. But while the second wedding could fix things for Leonard and Penny, it couldn't change the fact that the show's audience first had to sit through one of the least fun TV wedding episodes of all time.
I can't believe he's been gone a whole month.
Can we at least get rid of the doggy door so Chris doesn't keep getting stuck in it?
Every day I get a little further in.
Any television show that manages to last 10 seasons or more has to have both a loyal fan base and a strong set of characters. But what tends to happen over time, as these shows go on, is writers lose sight of what made those characters beloved in the first place. This tends to culminate in an episode that so completely and utterly misses the mark that it becomes clear that the show has hit a point of no return. For the long-running animated series Family Guy, that episode is season 12, episode 6, The Life of Brian. On IMDb, The Life of Brian is one of the lowest ranked episodes of the entirety of Family Guy's run. It's difficult to say if that ranking is simply because fans disliked the creative choice to kill off Brian, or if they genuinely believe it was a bad episode.
Damn it, Brian, you can't die! We were gonna do so many things together!
Following the episode's airing, a Change.org petition launched and quickly gained thousands of signatures, begging Seth MacFarlane to bring back Brian. But when you rewatch the episode, the major flaws in its structure and storytelling become clear. In order to truly understand why The Life of Brian is a perfect illustration of the worst of Family Guy, it's important to look back on where the series began. Initially airing in 1999 on Fox, it'd be easy to write off Family Guy as a clone of Fox's other beloved animated family sitcom, The Simpsons. What set Family Guy apart was its willingness to embrace absurdism with its reality-breaking cutaway gags that would become a staple of the series.
I'm the king of the world!
Where the show begins to decline can be charted all the way back to its 4th season following its initial cancellation.
Everybody, I got bad news. We've been canceled.
However, the series would gain new life in reruns on Adult Swim and through DVD sales. This groundswell of support would be enough for Fox to bring the show back in 2004. This was unheard of for the time period. Today, with such a gluttony of streaming services constantly looking for content, canceled TV shows are often given at least one second chance at life. But in 2004, this was a pretty unprecedented moment, especially since that renewal would lead to an 18-year run of the show. Not only did Family Guy not die, it now seemed to be immortal. The excitement over the show's return was short-lived. The resurrected version of the show had started to rely more and more on the show's pop culture references and cutaway gags.
There it is, boys, the fountain of youth, just like I told you.
The characters began to feel more like joke delivery machines rather than well-rounded characters who the audience would enjoy spending time with each week. However, this wasn't always the case with the show. Although Family Guy always had a bit of a more cynical streak when compared to shows like The Simpsons or King of the Hill, there was some semblance of heart. The characters had personalities that felt authentic despite being in such a cartoony world. This is perhaps best illustrated by the Season 3 episode, Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows. Now, despite the crass title, it's a genuinely moving episode that succeeds in many of the ways The Life of Brian fails. The episode follows Brian as he forms a bond with an elderly opera singer named Pearl Burton, who found fame doing commercial jingles, but never found the artistic fulfillment she truly desired. Brian finds in Pearl a fellow appreciator of the arts, and he yearns to show her the world she's missed out on during her years as a recluse. Following a night on the town, Pearl is hit by a truck and dies, but not before Brian takes her on a virtual simulation of the life they could have led together. The episode is poignant and bittersweet, and deliberate or not, feels like an homage to the old crooner singers that Seth MacFarlane clearly has a soft spot for. Even the episode's B-plot about baby birds and Peter's beard pairs perfectly with Brian's journey of love gained and lost. This episode is a perfect encapsulation of the type of emotional journey that Life of Brian fails to truly evoke in the audience. It's impossible to imagine Family Guy ever being able to recapture that kind of emotional weight in its current form. and Life of Brian is the evidence. Right from the start, the episode feels disorienting, as if we're watching the second part of a two-part episode. We open on Brian and Stewie fleeing from a group of Native Americans after apparently traveling back in time to Jamestown and altering history by giving modern-day weaponry to the Native Americans to fight the colonizing Europeans. It's a truly baffling choice to open this episode about Brian's death and its impact on the family with this complete non sequitur of a plotline that wastes nearly 10 minutes of a 28-minute episode. Once it's made clear that the show uses this episode to kill off Brian, it feels like an even greater waste of time. The haphazard nature of this episode continues when Stewie decides to destroy his time machine in a junkyard. While there, Brian finds an old street hockey goal and encourages Stewie to play a game with him. During their game, Brian is abruptly struck by a car and killed. One could argue the structure of this episode is meant to startle the viewer by making them think they are in for another run-of-the-mill Family Guy episode. But by wasting the already brief runtime of the show, it leaves the drama of the moment completely hollow. Brian's death feels more like a rushed attempt to write an actor out of a show who decided not to renew their contract, rather than a genuine emotional goodbye to a beloved character. To make matters worse, the third act of the episode focuses on the family trying to move on by getting a new dog, Vinny. While the character is amusing,
What breed are you? Actually, I'm a pussy hound. Really? All right. That just means I'm 1/16th cat. Oh, I wish you hadn't told me that.
it's again strange to immediately try and replace the character of Brian within the same episode. The episode ends with a note that seems to suggest Vinny will be helping Stewie to move on after the loss of his friend, but sincerity has been so far removed from the Family Guy formula at this point, it's hard to genuinely feel for the pathos of the characters that the writers are trying to present to the viewer. In an interview about the episode with E, writer Steve Callahan discussed the decision to kill off Brian, stating, "This was an idea that got pitched in the writer's room, and it sort of caught fire, and we thought it could be a fun way to shake things up." Now, one has to wonder how serious Callahan was in that moment, considering that Brian would return in episode 8, meaning he's only truly absent for one whole episode. Considering the lengthy turnaround time it takes to produce an animated episode of television like Family Guy, it's clear that it was always the plan to take Brian off the board only for the briefest periods of time. This makes his death feel all the more like a calculated move to get people talking about the show again in its 12th season, or potentially a plotline the writers felt they wanted to try but didn't feel confident enough to fully commit to. Regardless of the reason, the death of Brian and his near immediate return illustrates one of the pitfalls of long-form storytelling. When a series goes on for so long, it takes more and more desperate, shocking moves to keep viewers engaged and talking. And what better way to shock than with the surprise death of a beloved character? This is a tactic superhero comic books have been using for years, and much like when it happens in comics, it's always very obvious when the writers don't intend for it to be permanent. Death is a powerful storytelling tool, but when the writers use it for arbitrary shock value, it not only loses its impact, but also betrays your audience. They'll begin to question why they've invested their love into a show if the writers treat the characters so carelessly. What's most frustrating about this episode is that the idea to kill off Brian could have worked if it had been a worthy enough send-off to this beloved character. Despite its best attempts, Family Guy is no longer a series capable of that type of emotional storytelling. The Life of Brian is the worst of the series, not because of the bad creative decision, but because it is a microcosm of all the ways Family Guy has lost its way as a show. The irony of all this is that the previously mentioned episode, Brian Wallows, Peter Swallows, is about learning to let go. Both Brian and Peter have to accept the impermanence of life, and that the things we love will eventually, in one form or another, leave us. Perhaps this was a lesson fans should have learned at the cancellation of Family Guy all the way back in season 3. It's perhaps better to have loved a show and lost it too soon than to watch it turn into something you can no longer enjoy.
Why would you hang a painting like this on your wall?
Well, it's the Historical Society, bro. They have to hang it up, you know?
Yeah. Oh, well, we gotta suffer just because some old dude who looks like Meryl Streep chopped down a cherry tree like 10 million years ago?
This is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Fellas, how you doing? A couple of flagons of ale for you. So I just want to say we love what you're doing over here.
And this is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia in 1776. In the 11th episode of the show's 4th season, titled The Gang Cracks the Liberty Bell, the gang takes their signature style of abrasive bantering and terrible decision-making skills back to the time of the American Revolution. This is arguably the worst episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which is weird because it occurs in the same season as arguably two of the best episodes of It's Always Sunny, in The Nightman Cometh and The Gang Solves the Gas Crisis.
Wild card, bitches!
Despite the cast's ability to deliver laughs at the right time, The Gang Cracks the Liberty Bell just never really comes together, and it's because it fails to do what makes the show so great. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is currently the longest-running live-action American sitcom of all time. The show began back in 2005 as an $80 pilot, and since then has become a cultural staple of American comedy. The show features an ensemble cast of morally bankrupt bar owners who cheat and manipulate pretty much every single person they come into contact with. In 2008, It's Always Sunny was in the middle of its 4th season and was still in the process of experimenting with its formula for success. During these experimental periods of television shows, writers began to take some risks by pushing the boundaries of what they can deliver to the audience without losing them entirely. Testing the boundaries in this way isn't always done with the intent of breaking them. Sometimes it's just to see where these boundaries are, so they can avoid breaking them in the future. The Gang Cracks the Liberty Bell imagines Charlie, Frank, Mac, Dennis, and Dee back in Philadelphia during the beginnings of the American Revolution as a reenactment of an elaborate con. Mac, Charlie, and Dennis are telling this completely fabricated historical inaccuracy to a city official in an attempt to get Patty's Pub acknowledged as a historical landmark. This is the first problem with this episode. You could argue that Glenn Howerton, Charlie Day, and Rog McElhenney are three of the funniest writers working in television. The characters that these three actors portray on the show are not hilarious writers, they are morally bankrupt idiots. Since this episode is essentially being written by Dennis Reynolds, Charlie Kelly, and Mac, it plays out as if it were written by three morally bankrupt idiots. This would be fine if the episode somehow took an occasional moment to remind us that this is a reenactment of a fictional yarn being spun by the guys, which leads us to the second problem. It never does. Imagine comedy as a big balloon being filled with helium. If we don't tether that balloon to something real, it will float off into the sky until it destroys itself. When you create a rather large comedic premise, you need something equally strong with which to anchor your idea. This episode never really tethers itself to anything real. It just presents its fictional premise and lets go until the final 30 seconds when we cut back to what is happening in the real world. While this closing moment is undoubtedly funny, it just doesn't really achieve the desired effect. There was a missed opportunity here to build a heightening pattern of cutaways that would have likely helped keep the insane premise in perspective. Drunk History is an example of a show that uses these types of real-world cutaways to its advantage. These moments allow us to break from the action and take a breath in the real world before diving back into the premise. Resting your comedy is an essential pacing tool, and when utilized correctly, it delivers some fantastic results.
Oh, this is a great drink. They thought that it made them invigorated and aware. People are basically drinking little cocaine soda.
The Gang Cracks the Liberty Bell never comes up for air. It just, it drowns itself. The third way in which this episode fails is that it doesn't treat the time period with any reverence. This is likely an undesired hangover effect from problem number 1. We can never truly immerse ourselves into this world of 1776 Sunny because this episode only steps halfway into it. It's Always Sunny's comedy is driven through unmitigated commitment, but in this episode, everything feels like it's half measure. Instead of playing toward the drama and seriousness of the American Revolution and putting our ridiculous characters inside of it, this episode plays to an incredibly esoteric joke that the writers are essentially telling to themselves. The dialogue shifts between half-assed version of 18th century English in one moment.
Pardon me, good sirs. But which of you gentlemen happens to be the highest-ranking military officer here?
And calling British soldiers bro in the next.
Bro, it's 1776. They don't have any rights. You can just take them and force them to do whatever you want.
This is undoubtedly intentional, but without anchoring it back to the three guys telling this story from time to time, it doesn't really land in the intended way. The thing that makes It's Always Sunny's characters pop is the seriousness of the real world, which leads us to the fourth and final issue with this episode. We're never really emotionally invested enough to care about what's going on. The writers never tell us exactly why we as an audience should care about this story. We don't get that signature It's Always Sunny cold open at the top of this episode. That absolutely fundamental piece of puzzle is completely absent from The Gang Cracks the Liberty Bell. Without it, we never have any understanding of what's at stake or why it's important. The only real mention of any real-world stakes comes with a sort of throwaway line from Dennis, where he states that he wants to get the bar recognized as a historical landmark so people can come and get smashed.
You know, they can come by, soak up some history, do some shots, get blasted.
This episode is so lost in its own premise that it ends with the main characters setting up the premise again.
So you know what? Sit back, get comfortable. This is gonna take a little longer this time. Okay, you ready?
It starts the same.
Okay.
The year was 1776.
There's no rhyming, no connections, none of that tight and concise writing that comes together in the final moments of any great It's Always Sunny episode. It just sort of ends exactly where it starts, and in turn, makes us feel like our characters have effectively gone nowhere. The Gang Cracks the Liberty Bell is arguably the weakest episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia to date. At times, this episode feels like it's from an entirely different series. It's one thing to take risks with the way you structure your television show, but completely eradicating every successful element of your show goes well beyond just taking a risk and into the realm of self-destruction.
Would you like a spot of tea? You? Yes!
On paper, taking the cast of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and putting them in a different time period sounds like it would be a home run. But telling this story through the lens of a misinformed con in process removes the structure of what makes It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia so successful. It's Always Sunny is at its best when it challenges its stunted and arguably reprehensible cast of characters to exist in the real world, and in turn, these characters are forced to face real-world consequences for their actions. When you put these ridiculous characters into an equally ridiculous environment, it becomes almost impossible for anything to really stand out. This episode is all premise and no structure. The end results in something that feels about as flat as Mac's wooden teeth.
Yeah, well, all the Patriots are doing it, including Washington, which is why it makes sense, okay, if we're going undercover.
Writing long-form comedy is like cooking a really fancy dinner. You have to apply the right techniques at the right times to deliver the desired result. You need to know when to apply the heat and when to let the things rest. And most importantly, you need a balance of flavors. If you just pile the same ingredient on top of itself, the odds are that you're going to be left with something that tastes terrible and looks like a mess. The key ingredient in this recipe is reality. Comedy craves reality. The absurd needs to be treated as if it were completely normal. And in turn, the normal needs to be treated as if it were completely absurd. This episode does neither, and instead it piles absurdity on top of absurdity, and the result is that nothing stands out. This episode just sort of forces itself to blend into its own weirdness until we can't really see what's funny anymore. When everything is crazy, craziness just becomes normal, and normal is a place where comedy goes to die.